Hello, and welcome to the first episode of The Apothecary. This is a new podcast, a new project that I've started, and I want to talk about the science behind psychoactive drugs. So, how they affect our mood, our sensation, our thinking, our behavior, our mind at wide. But at the same time, I want to talk about the historical side of psychoactive drugs, the development, the controversies, the developments in the field as of late, the building blocks of how we got to where we are with psychoactive treatments. So a little background on me as your host. My name is Brian Kotzen. I'm an undergraduate at West Virginia University, where I study neuroscience, and I currently work in a behavioral neuroscience lab as an undergraduate research assistant. So my roots with neuroscience go back to a high school psychology course where I was really drawn to the sections of the course about the anatomy of the brain and how the anatomy of our brain influences so much of our daily lives. It's responsible for emotions, behaviors, thoughts, and motivations. And as I kept doing research out of just interest, it became apparent to me that at its core, the brain's chemistry is responsible for a lot of what I was interested in. So a lot of the brain's functions that were fascinating to me, this influence on our emotions, behaviors, thoughts, and motivations, these were results of the brain's chemistry. I mean, emotion, just looking at that's such a large, complicated construct when it comes to psychology, and it boils down to chemical interactions in our brain. How do these chemicals interact? How do they communicate information? And it's such an individualistic idea, but it's fascinating to me that a handful of chemicals in our brain have so much weight over our life. That's something that just blew me away. But, when I started doing some research out of interest, you hit major roadblocks. The biggest problem when it comes to trying to teach yourself any higher level concept is just the amount of jargon that you have to wade through and all the concepts that you have to have a grasp on before you can really get into reading anything about what you're interested in. That's true for just about any higher level concept. In neuroscience, it's especially prominent. It's in everything that we do. If you look at something like calculus, a higher level math, it's incredibly complex, and you have to have this grasp on algebra and trigonometry before you can really move to calculus. And it's even in the humanities, higher level English is insane. You have to have such a concrete grasp on the language as a whole to really understand and analyze its use. And it extends throughout all higher level concepts. So what I wanted to do was make education about drugs something accessible, because I think that drug education on itself is something that's very difficult for just a passing enthusiast to get into. It's incredibly difficult to sit down and just teach yourself how drugs work, because oftentimes if you sit down with like a Wikipedia article, they start throwing organic chemistry at you, and they throw these really high level ideas in biology, and it just makes it really hard to understand. So what I want to do is kind of break it down to a simpler level where it's easier to learn about, it's easier to become educated about it, because there are a lot of people who are prescribed psychoactive drugs, and helping them understand what they're putting in their body is a major thing. But at the same time, there are people like me who just find it interesting and want to read about the field because the idea of it is fascinating, and the scope of what drugs do to our brain is so extended. I mean, so many different drugs have different effects on different areas of our brain, and they cause such different effects. Sometimes they cause polar opposite effects to each other. And it's just very interesting to me. And I know that it's difficult to wade through all that jargon. So what I want to do is help people like me who have an interest just be able to cut through that jargon and learn about it. And also, I just think that this is kind of fun, you know? I think the podcast setting is something that I've been attracted to for a long time. I think the ability to convey information that it gives you is really effective. And overall, I'm just really excited to start with the podcast. This is a project I've had on the back burner for just over a year, I think. I've really been contemplating and only recently really took serious action about it. So when it comes to certain drugs, what interests me about them is that alteration of our brain's chemistry, because at the most basic level, when a drug interacts with our brain and it changes that chemistry, it leads to any number of changes that might happen. There are a lot of changes to mood, cognition, or thinking, our behavior, our sensation, our perception of those sensations. So whenever a drug affects these areas of our life and of our mind, we consider that drug psychoactive. And psychopharmacology is the study of the effect of drugs on mood, thinking, and behavior. So the field is really wide, and it primarily focuses on how substances interact in a chemical sense. A lot of people's first thoughts when they hear psychoactive drugs might jump to narcotics, but there are a huge number of clinical psychoactive drugs that we're going to come to discuss in future episodes. Now, I think that illicit drugs are especially interesting just because of the controversy associated with them, because a lot of these clinical drugs, there isn't as much controversy. There still might be controversy, like with stimulants. A major thing would just be the overprescription lately, that a lot of people are noticing the overdiagnosis of ADHD, and transitionally the overprescription of things like Ritalin or Adderall to kind of treat something that might not even be there. So there are controversies within even the clinical realm of psychopharmacology, but I think the controversies associated with something like cannabis are especially appealing, because the research lab that I work in, actually we study cannabinoids, and it's kind of weird to separate cannabis from its cultural impact, because I think it has had a very significant cultural impact. I think it's left lasting impressions on society, and it will continue to do so. But I just think it's incredibly interesting how the drug works, you know, the individual cannabinoids, the way they affect our brain and the way they affect different systems in the human body are fascinating to me. And I think it's absolutely mind-blowing when you get into any substance, just kind of reading about what it does to people. And even more fascinating, I think, are these first-hand encounters that people will share. So, you know, a lot of stories about psychedelics, for example, are just intense. And I mean, when people really get into it, it's just a crazy experience to hear about, that a small pill, just barely any more than a couple micrograms of a substance, can do something so immense to somebody. It's absolutely incredible to me. So the general structure of this podcast is going to go a little something like this. Every episode, or every few episodes, are going to be about a new substance or a new class of substances. I'm going to start by talking about the history of a given substance's, when was it discovered or when was it developed? What cultural impact has the substance had? Are there any controversies that might be associated with that substances? And if so, what are the arguments on both sides of that controversy? What do both sides have to say about the legality or the efficacy of that drug? Is it really a good drug? And after I've talked about the history and the impact, I want to talk about how the drug works. What systems of the body does this drug affect, and how do those systems then influence our mind? How does this drug change the way that we think or the way that we process information? And do its properties and effects make it an effective treatment, and or do they make it a rewarding recreational substance? And finally, at the end, I want to take a look at some listener-provided questions. So if you have any questions that fall under the umbrella of topics we're going to be covering, I will gladly do some research and answer anything to the best of my ability. And if something falls out of my knowledge, or I'm really just not able to find the answers through research, I will gladly direct you to resources that might be able to help you answer that question. So for the first episode, I'm not really going to be talking about a substance. I want to talk a little bit about the history of psychopharmacology wide. It's important to acknowledge the roots of psychoactive drug use in human history and how the pathway to modern drug treatments and modern psychopharmacology was paved. So, psychoactive drugs and their use among humans go way back. Hunter-gatherer societies could be found consuming hallucinogens, and that use still continues in many tribal cultures, whether it be for a religious purpose like a sacrament or a ritual, but that's something that we see a lot in those days, and it's something that continues in tribal cultures. For instance, you think of something like ayahuasca, that's a powerful psychoactive psychedelic, and it's used in rituals, and it's kind of given this status as a holy substance. It's kind of interesting to see those early days, that early use of psychedelics is incredibly interesting. And the medicinal use of herbs, so not necessarily just hallucinogens or psychedelics, just any kind of psychoactive herb, that was common as far as 60,000 years ago, when we were still a nomadic species. In the late Stone Age, which is around 12,000 years ago, agriculture became a common practice, and with agriculture came accelerated opiate, alcohol, and cannabis use. And those three substances are still kind of the trifecta of significant current psychoactive substances. Opiates kind of in the spotlight for controversy, and alcohol and cannabis being probably the two most famous recreational psychoactive drugs. So when agriculture came around, we had societies develop, and we had people staying in one place for extended periods of times. And those different cultures developed, and worldwide they began publishing herbals, which are descriptions of herbs and what ailments they might cure. In ancient Egypt, we see this as medical texts that have been found, and they contain descriptions of herbs. The Ebers Papyrus, in particular, dating from around 1550 BC, covers more than 700 compounds of primarily plant origin. And these were found buried with pharaohs, sometimes in tombs. They would have just these sprawling pictures of herbs and, descriptions of what they would do. And sometimes in urns or large pieces of pottery that would contain herbs, you would find just a description of like what ailments the herb might help with and what the herb kind of functioned as. So those were some of the earliest writings found kind of in relation to herb use. And early Greek herbals ranged from around the 4th to the 1st century BC. And they've only really survived in fragments. There aren't many complete ones, but what scholars have found does overlap a lot with the ancient Egyptian herbals. So separated almost 1,100 years, the information is still consistent, which is interesting. And herbs were a major cornerstone of ancient Indian medicine and are hugely present in early Chinese medical texts. So De Materia Medica was a pharmacopoeia, or kind of in the realm of an herbal, but a little bit more descriptive. It was written by Pedanius Dioscorides between 50 and 70 AD. It was a 5-volume work, and it covered different medicinal plants and medicines derived from medicinal plants. It was widely used for more than 1,500 years until the Renaissance, when revised herbals were brought about. And the 5 volumes of the work were split up by categories and classified by similarities. And as it progressed, we moved to the Renaissance, where herbals are more refined and herbal medicine is a little bit more rock solid, and we have good record of it. And an establishment in medieval Europe where wines, herbs, spices were sold is called an apothecary, which is kind of the name of the podcast. It's the reasoning. I just figured that it was kind of a cute, fun thing. So herbal medicine, I know I've been talking about it in kind of this ancient context just thousands of years ago, but it's still common across the world. It's estimated that about 80% of Asian and African countries rely on herbal medicine as their primary source of healthcare. Even in the Americas and Europe, herbal medicine is still in wide use, although it's sometimes called alternative or traditional medicine. So the administration of herbs in herbal medicine is usually via a liquid concentration or a tea, and that would be the primary way that herbalism was practiced, was the brewing of these teas or the preparation of these concentrates. And these early herbalists kind of paved the way for psychopharmacology, because several early ritualistic practices used psychoactive substances, typically a hallucinogen or a psychedelic. So they were treated as some kind of holy experience. So in a way, psychopharmacology kind of begins from this very religious place. The earliest application of a lot of intense psychoactive drugs was to kind of reach to a higher power. And it makes sense because the intense sensory experience of something like a psychedelic would be really jarring to kind of these early societies. The experience of synesthesia that you might experience with a psychedelic, where you kind of flip your senses. You might hear sounds, or you might see just kind of these vivid colors. Those were probably downright insane to them. They didn't really have any way to explain that. And I feel like religion was kind of a plausible explanation for such a surreal experience. But psychopharmacology has traveled a long way since those days. We now have an understanding of the brain that lets us explain, psychoactive effects in purely scientific ways. Early modern applications of psychopharmacology were mainly concerned with sedation, so opiates and barbiturates were the primary common drug types. But in the 50s, we see chlorpromazine was established as a treatment for psychoses. Lithium carbonate became a treatment for mania, and a lot of antidepressants and antipsychotics became treatments. And this early research established the use of placebo-controlled double-blind studies. So these are kind of the gold standard and it's really what you picture when you think of drug research, is the sample is randomly assigned either a substance in the study, the primary substance that they're concerned with, or they're given a placebo pill that is not the substance. They are not told which they are given. And the purpose of these studies is to find out if a drug is effectively treating what we want it to treat. If the placebo is just as effective as the substance, it might not treat what we want it to, or it might not effectively treat it. So the double blind refers to the fact that not even the researcher really knows who's in what group. It's randomly assigned, and this ensures that the researcher isn't biased. And this method still remains as a standard in a lot of clinical research. It's maintained. And it's still sticking around. I mean, it's back to the 50s when that was developed, and 70 years later, we still use it when we want to see the effectiveness of a treatment. In the 60s, the mechanics governing nerve signals and synaptic transmission, they were described in a model that Julius Axelrod was the founder of. He put it forward. And the main area of it described more fully how neurotransmitters work. So the way that neurotransmitters work is that in the axon terminal of a neuron, which if you think about a neuron, it's at the very end. So electrical impulses cause these neurotransmitters to travel from the presynaptic nerve ending, which is where they're stored, which is on just the end of the neuron. They travel into the synapse, which is the space between the end of one neuron and the beginning of other neurons. So Axelrod is behind the idea that neurotransmitters are recaptured by the presynaptic nerve ending and recycled. So that process is called reuptake. And it was big in that it put forward the idea that neurotransmitters are recycled, they have reuse, and they don't just dissipate after they bond with the next neuron, which was a common idea. So that research led to the foundation of drugs like Prozac, which inhibit the reuptake of serotonin in order to increase the amount of serotonin in the synapse at a given time. So they're actually called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So serotonin is the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's associated with happiness and well-being, which is why drugs like Prozac are kind of marketed as a depression treatment, because more serotonin means less depression. It's just kind of increasing the amount of happiness or well-being in a way. So more serotonin in the synapse is a treatment outcome that's strived for in a lot of depression treatments. And after Axelrod discovered that model, it was followed by a boom in biochemical brain research. So a lot of research into how psychoactive substances affected brain chemistry came about. And after the 60s, the field of psychiatry began incorporating psychoactive treatments into their practice. And their research focused on the use and the effectiveness of these new psychoactive drugs. So once we achieved a better grasp of our brain's chemistry and its mechanisms, we were able to better understand how psychoactive substances work. And we developed new drugs for new purposes. And that takes us right up to today, where the field of psychopharmacology is still hard at work, furthering our understanding of drugs and how they interact with the brain. So that's a very broad overview of the history. And as we get deeper into specific substances, it'll be a lot more fleshed out. But at the moment, these are like the really big events. These are the kind of the monumental achievements. And it's just a very wide view because, we're going from our days as a hunter-gatherer society to the 1960s, which is a lot of ground to cover, but it's very interesting to see how, we started with just kind of picking herbs out of the ground, and we figured out which ones helped with which disorders or whatever their use was, just kind of a lot of trial and error. And the interesting thing is that psychoactive consumption is not limited to human use. Zoopharmaconocy is the act of animals self-medicating by applying or topically ingesting plants, soils, insects, and of primary interest, psychoactive substances. So it's really interesting that it's not something that's exclusive to us, since we have these higher order mechanisms of thinking. It's really, really fascinating that it's not something that's exclusive to us, and that there are animals that recognize the utility of certain naturally occurring psychoactive substances. And when I say that this podcast is about psychoactive drugs and how they interact with the brain, again, I just want to hit home that doesn't mean every week is going to be about LSD, cocaine, ecstasy, all this controversial illicit stuff. There's going to be a lot of focus on widely prescribed drugs, such as antidepressants or stimulants. And I think a really important thing is the parallels between those substances and the illicit ones. Because a lot of times, illicit drugs are just a very strong, concentrated version of a prescribed drug. If someone's abusing cocaine, which is a central nervous system stimulant, it's an amplified version of a regular stimulant, I mean, they're structurally very different, but at its core, the effects are very similar, just a lot more intense. And I think that a big interest is what makes a socially acceptable drug. Because a lot of things are treated, especially like going through the education system, they kind of treat things like marijuana. It's just like, that's really bad. Like, you don't want to deal with that. Like, if someone offers you any kind of narcotic, you just say no. But at the same time, a lot of prescription of psychoactive drugs, it's like, well, does the fact that that's just a milder effect make it okay? And it's just really interesting because I think a lot of it is really just about the stigma. And I think it's an important conversation to look at from all sides, because I think there are a lot of preconceptions on both sides of that argument. And an important distinction to make is that an interest in drugs does not automatically make you a drug user. It's perfectly fine to have an interest in the mechanics of drugs or how they work. The ethics of drug use are not something I'm really going to take a side on. This is a neutral zone for drug education and drug discussion. I don't condone any drug use, but I'm also not going to be demonizing it. All I want to do is introduce people to a field that I find fascinating and just kind of help them dip their feet in and build an interest in it. Maybe it's a potential interest. Maybe it's something you want to end up working in one day. Just kind of getting education out there, because I think that there isn't enough, and what there is can be a little bit hard to access. So thank you so much for listening to the first episode of my podcast. I've been meaning to create this for a while now, but I never actually sat down to do it. I ask for your continuing support as I continue this podcast. I'd like you to stick around, listen to future episodes. Hopefully they'll be good. Hopefully this one was good. So I hope to see you soon. I'll be posting to my Twitter about kind of what you guys would like to see next. Probably running a poll or two, because I think I have some ideas of what I'd like to get into. But I really just kind of want to get you guys' feedback of what sounds good. So my Twitter is at Apothecary Pod. So I'll be updating there. If you follow my personal Twitter account, I'll probably redirect to that. I probably did that like yesterday by the time this is going up. So if you have any email questions, you can email me at theapothecast@gmail.com. So if you have any questions, like I said earlier in the show, I want to take some time at the end of every episode to address incoming questions and just kind of see what you guys want to learn about and what I can help you guys kind of do some research on. And definitely, if you want to email me some feedback on how things are going, fantastic. Any criticism is really welcome, especially because I'd really like to improve and see where things are going to go from here. So I want to give you a huge thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this. I want to give a huge thank you to anyone and everyone who's supported me through the conceptual stage of this podcast, which is, as I said, it's drawn out over a year. I've had a script half completed for a couple of months now. I've been considering this project for a long time now, so it wasn't an easy process. I was very glad to revive this project, though, pretty recently. I'm very glad I have the people to keep me motivated and working hard at this. So, again, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you for the next episode.